Welcome back to the deep dive. Today, we're really immersing ourselves in something quite intense. It's a collection of philosophical excerpts, and honestly, they offer this incredibly stark, almost unnerving look at human existence.
Mm-hmm. They really do.
Yeah.
These sources, they're not about feel-good messages at all. They're laser-focused on, well, what they see as the singular existential problem.
Right, the nature of suffering and what genuine spiritual knowledge, they call it, atetcham, what it actually has to achieve. It's demanding.
Oh, incredibly demanding. And critical. You said it's stark is a good word. It's almost a brutal assessment, really.
Hmm.
They basically argue that most of what we spend our lives doing, our careers, hobbies, achievements, all of it, it's
Right.
largely secondary.
Secondary or even irrelevant.
Yeah, exactly. Irrelevant when you weigh it against this crisis that, well, they argue is waiting for every single one of us.
Mhm.
It forces you to confront the end game.
So our mission today is, I suppose, to really unpack this philosophy. We need to understand how they argue that previous happiness can bizarrely become a source of active torment later on.
Right. A very counterintuitive idea.
And how this necessity, this absolute need for solution, defines what real knowledge, real spirituality must accomplish. It's moving past spirituality as just, daily comfort.
Definitely. It frames it as an existential necessity,
Yeah.
not a lifestyle choice.
And we're kicking off with this really radical core premise, aren't we?
We are, according to these sources, the only thing, literally the only thing stopping most modern humans from desperately needing true spiritual knowledge right now
Uh-huh.
is the simple biological fact that we get, say, 6 to 8 hours of peaceful sleep every night.
Sleep. Just sleep.
Just sleep. That period of daily peace, what they call nidra, it's presented as the great postponement. It's like this temporary cognitive Band-Aid.
A Band-Aid that keeps reality manageable.
Exactly. But they argue quite forcefully
Yeah.
that this Band-Aid gets ripped off
Hmm.
completely and violently during the continuous suffering of old age.
Okay, right. Let's unpack that, because if sleep is the only thing standing between us and essentially an immediate spiritual crisis,
Yeah.
then the crucial part must be understanding what happens when that daily break, that respite, vanishes.
Okay, so first, we really have to grasp the state they call vrithavastha. Translates pretty directly to the condition of old age, but they define it very specifically. It's old age as a state of crisis.
Not just getting older, but a crisis state.
Precisely.
Yeah.
And the sources are absolutely relentless on this point. The suffering involved isn't just, say, the final moments before death. It's protracted, continuous.
So not a quick illness, not a sudden event, but drawn out.
Drawn out, yes. We're talking about years, potentially, of unrelenting pain and distress.
And when you say years, you mean literally like calendar years of just unbroken misery.
That's exactly what they emphasize. The text doesn't mince words at all. It says this state of continuous affliction, this kasht. It lasts for years. Could be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, maybe even 6 continuous years.
Wow. 6 years.
And this unending distress, they argue, effectively nullifies, or at the very least completely overshadows, all the previous stages of life. Childhood, youth, adulthood, all of it.
So what makes the suffering different? I mean, people get seriously ill in middle age, right? Is it just the intensity or?
It's the intensity combined with, crucially, the total loss of agency. That seems to be the key. The individual is described as becoming completely helpless. The word used is asahe,
Ase, helpless.
and entirely dependent, lashar.
Lashar dependent.
So it's this realization, not only are you in constant pain, but you are utterly incapable of doing anything about it.
Yeah.
You can't even manage basic bodily functions without help.
That loss of self-sufficiency, that's the core of the crisis then.
That's how they frame it, yes. The crisis is defined by that total dependence.
Okay, so if that's the condition, helplessness, then we have to talk about the failure of material success. Because, I mean, in our world, isn't accumulating wealth precisely about preventing helplessness, insurance, good care, staff?
And that, according to these sources, is a profound delusion, a really deep one. They state very clearly that when you reach this final state of affliction, all that financial wealth, the dam, the possessions, all the modern comforts, they're rendered fundamentally useless.
Useless. But surely they can buy better care, a nicer room. How can it be useless?
Well, they can buy services, yes. Better care, maybe. But they cannot buy relief from the internal state of continuous suffering. That's the distinction they draw.
Ah, okay. So it's the difference between external management and internal experience.
Exactly. Think about something as basic as eating, sustenance. The source notes that this afflicted state, it's not calmed just by eating food.
Right.
The person might struggle severely even to eat, or maybe they manage to eat, but they still experience all sorts of acute discomfort, nausea, pain, stomach breakdown.
So your money buys you the fancy meal, but it can't buy your body the ability to process it without agony?
Precisely. The suffering is internal, it's systemic, it's relentless, it just doesn't care about your bank balance.
That sounds incredibly harsh. But, it also sounds like something we should know. We see this happening all around us, don't we? Every generation witnesses this.
We do. We absolutely do. And yet the sources suggest we actively ignore it.
How so?
Well, the text includes this really insightful, almost uncomfortable social commentary.
Yeah.
It says that most people, particularly when they're young and strong, they observe the intense suffering of the elderly around them, but they maintain this strange kind of cognitive dissonance.
Like, that won't happen to me.
Exactly that.
Yeah.
They operate under this implicit belief that somehow their fate will be different. They treat this universal path as if it's just an unfortunate thing happening to other people, irrelevant to them personally.
And that denial can lead to pretty poor behavior too, right? The text mentions people mocking or treating the elderly badly.
It does, because they fail to recognize the universality of this decline. It's a kind of willful blindness to their own future, their own inevitable trajectory.
And that blindness, that denial, is only possible because of what you mentioned earlier, the great spiritual bypass.
Exactly. Which brings us right back to this idea of nidra as a temporary solution. The source argues, very pointedly, that for most of our lives, we can function perfectly well without self-knowledge, without atmagain, precisely because those 6, 7, 8 hours of daily sleep provide a regular, guaranteed period of peaceful respite.
This is where the argument gets really deep, I think. We just take sleep for granted, but here it's positioned as this essential spiritual buffer.
It's more than just a buffer, according to them. It's an unconscious state of actual comfort, of release. The source is almost like in deep sleep nidra to an unconscious form of temporary samadhi, a temporary liberation.
Wow. Like a mini liberation every night.
In effect, yes. For that duration, you are free. Free from your body's aches, free from your desires, your worries, your memories, even your sense of self, really. It's guaranteed peace.
And that guaranteed peace allows us to cope with the other 16 or so hours without needing a deeper solution.
Exactly. It lets us manage the anxieties, the minor distresses of daily life, without ever having to truly solve the underlying existential problem of continuous conscious existence in a decaying body.
So the body hits a kind of reset button every day, which lets us postpone the big questions, the existential reckoning, until we're physically too weak to actually seek the solution effectively.
That's the trap they describe. The moment you enter Vriddhavastha, this protracted suffering, that peaceful reset button, sleep, it stops working reliably.
Ah, right. Insomnia, pain interrupting sleep.
All of it. The body's ability to provide that deep, restorative, comforting rest just diminishes. The pains become too constant, too sharp. The mind's too agitated.
So the peace vanishes.
The peace vanishes, your strength is declining daily, and suddenly you're fully caught, trapped in a miserable, continuous reality. 247. For years.
The temporary liberation of sleep is gone.
It's gone. And now the person is forced, really forced, to confront their existence around the clock. This, they argue, is the moment when the need for true spirituality, for adhetyam, becomes an acute physical necessity, not just a philosophical interest or a weekend hobby.
It's interesting then. Modern medicine often keeps people alive longer, but sometimes in exactly this dependent state. Does that mean medicine actually makes this philosophical problem worse?
If you follow the logic of these sources, yes, absolutely. It seems it would. Any system, any technology that prolongs the body's existence while the senses and strength are completely depleted, well, it just lengthens that period of acute, helpless suffering.
It extends the time you're stuck in Vriddhavastha.
Right. It brings the full weight of that state to bear, making the lack of a spiritual resolution, the inability to find peace while fully conscious and suffering, all the more agonizing.
Okay, so that transition from a life managed by the temporary fix of sleep to this absolute crisis state, it seems to hinge on the psychological impact of the body just breaking down.
Yes, the body's strength, the power of the senses, what they call indriyan kabal, it declines daily, remorselessly, leading inevitably towards a painful end. And that current miserable reality becomes all-consuming. It completely overwhelms everything that came before.
And this is where the trauma of memory kicks in, as you said, the connection to the bigger picture.
Exactly. The entire span of your previous life, no matter how amazing, how successful, how joyful it was. It just becomes a memory, a yadash.
Okay, a memory, that makes sense.
But here's the twist. This memory isn't benign. It's not a comfort. The source insists it actively contributes to the present suffering.
Right, this is the really radical claim. It just flies in the face of all conventional wisdom about looking back on a happy life, finding solace in memories.
He does.
The philosophy states there's a negative value to past pleasure, that the more happiness, anand, the more comfort, maj, the more enjoyment, fog you pursued in youth, the greater the suffering will be in old age.
It's presented as a kind of psychological double blow.
Why? What's the mechanism there? How can happy memories make things worse?
It's the contrast, the
Yeah.
painful dissonance. Imagine, say, a world champion athlete who, in old age, can barely walk, or a renowned gourmet chef who loses their sense of taste completely.
Okay.
When the suffering is intense, when it's continuous, inescapable, the memory of past joy, past power, past ability, it doesn't console you. It doesn't act as a palliative. Instead, it serves as this constant, bitter reminder, look at what I was, look at the strength I had, the pleasure I could experience, and now I am utterly, hopelessly cut off from it.
The gap between the remembered self, the powerful self, and the current helpless self, that's what generates the extra pain.
That dissonance is key. That gap multiplies the agony. It adds significantly to both the mental and the physical torment. So the joyful memory stops being a pleasant recollection and becomes an active source of present distress.
It creates a feeling of loss that's much sharper, much more acute than if the person had lived a simpler life.
Exactly. If life was simpler, more ascetic perhaps, the contrast between past and present wouldn't be so stark, so brutal.
So, in a weird way, the joy of youth is like an investment that pays out negatively in old age, unless you solve the end game, unless you resolve this biological crisis.
That is precisely the source's conclusion, yes. And they use this incredibly vivid, almost shocking scenario to hammer the point home.
Which one is that?
They say, imagine someone who lived, let's say, 90 years of just maximal comfort, perfect health, endless enjoyment, everything they ever wanted, a truly fantastic life by any normal measure.
Okay, 90 years of bliss.
Right. But then, if that same person endures just 10 continuous days of intense, helpless pain before they die,
Only 10 days.
just 10 days of that Ridavasa state, the source argues that those 10 days of current, unending, helpless distress will effectively nullify the entire 90 years of previous enjoyment.
Nullify. That sounds extreme. How can 10 days wipe out 90 years? Psychologically, surely the good memories still count for something.
That's the core assumption the philosophy attacks. It asks, does it count when you are in that state? Their logic is that the intensity of the present misery is total, it's all-consuming, and crucially, it's happening against the backdrop of absolute helplessness.
Right.
When you're in that condition, the memory of those 90 years provides zero comfort. It offers no strength, no solace, no hope for relief. The only reality is the current pain.
And the memory of past joy just makes the current moment feel even crueler.
Exactly. It emphasizes the loss. So the present continuous failure, the failure to escape this suffering, retroactively negates the value of the temporary past success.
It's judging a life not by its peak moments, but by its final protracted state.
That seems to be the standard, yes.
Yeah.
Which leads directly to their central argument about fulfillment.
Right. If pursuing worldly desire carries this risk, the risk that it will turn on you and amplify suffering later,
Yeah.
then what's the point of striving for anything in the world?
Well, the source insists that no worldly desire, no ika, no matter how grandly you fulfill it.
Like political power, fame, wealth.
Any of it. None of it can provide lasting happiness if the fundamental cycle of suffering, aging, jara, and death, mrityu, isn't resolved first. All those achievements, all those fulfillments are just fleeting comforts that ultimately, they argue, just contribute to a painful memory bank later on.
But hang on, isn't this view maybe too harsh? Isn't some comfort better than none? Even if those last 10 days are terrible, surely 90 years of happiness wasn't worthless. Didn't it provide enjoyment at the time?
But that's the question they force you to ask. Was it truly fulfilling if it ends like that? If the happiness ultimately contributes to a greater sense of loss and abandonment when the body inevitably fails, if we define true fulfillment as a state of being, a peace that cannot be taken away by time or biology, then any pleasure rooted solely in the temporary power of the senses is, by definition, incomplete. They argue that when the individual is trapped in that continuous suffering, they aren't sitting there thinking nostalgically, oh, wasn't Paris lovely in the spring? They are desperately, frantically searching for relief now. And if their memories of Paris only serve to highlight their current inability to even, say, sit up comfortably, then that memory of happiness wasn't just neutral, it was actually detrimental to their ultimate peace in that final phase.
So what really has to stand out to you, the listener, is this incredibly radical conclusion. The only desire truly worth fulfilling, the only ikasha that holds real, non-diminishing value, is the one that brings about the eradication, the nirakaran, of the suffering tied to old age and death. Everything else is effectively a high-risk investment with potentially devastating negative returns.
It completely reframes the purpose of life. Away from accumulation or enjoyment and towards liberation. Liberation from a specific, biologically guaranteed state of protracted misery.
And that liberation, they claim, is the only goal that pays an infinite, non-diminishing dividend.
That's the assertion.
Okay, so this intense, almost obsessive focus on the crisis of old age, it forces a really revolutionary definition of what true spirituality, what attainment actually is.
It does. The philosophy argues that the real spiritual pursuit, the genuine journey, begins only when a person fully recognizes and accepts this unavoidable fate, this inescapable reality of continuous old age suffering.
So acceptance is the starting pistol.
It's the necessary catalyst, yes. It's the moment you realize, truly realize, that you are utterly helpless Lashar in the face of this biological decay. And that realization forces you to seek a solution that operates entirely outside the normal physical and material realm.
Because the physical and material have proven useless against this particular problem.
Exactly. And until that moment of realization, any spiritual seeking is perhaps just a hobby or maybe a way to find temporary comfort. Because remember, nidra, sleep, is still providing enough of a buffer to avoid the deeper, more desperate search.
This understanding, then, it immediately forces a really rigorous critique of a lot of what passes for spiritual practice today, doesn't it?
Oh, absolutely. If the ultimate goal, the only goal that matters, is solving Vriddhavasta, then many common activities simply fail the test.
Like what?
Well, the source explicitly urges the listener, urges you to critically examine conventional practices. Ask yourself, what specific kind of worship, what puja path, what ritual like yagya or havan can actually solve the biological continuous affliction of old age?
Not just make you feel better temporarily, but actually solve the underlying problem of suffering before death.
Precisely. Can it alleviate the suffering while it's happening continuously for years?
And if a spiritual practice cannot demonstrably resolve that issue, the source calls it
Useless. Bekar. A harsh word, but logical within their framework.
So if it doesn't fix the core problem, it can't, by their definition, lead to true peace, shanti, or ultimate liberation, mukti.
That's the argument. It's a purely functional definition. The success of any spirituality is judged solely by its effectiveness in eliminating the fear and ultimately the reality of that protracted pain.
And this same standard, this ruthless practicality, it also applies to the pursuit of supernatural powers, doesn't it?
Yeah.
The cities.
Yes, mercilessly.
Yeah.
This is a really critical point they make, one that distinguishes this adhetcham from maybe lower forms of mysticism or magic. The sources strongly criticize seeking abilities like, flying or teleporting, becoming invisible, hearing things at a distance, all those classic powers.
But wait, wouldn't having powers like that be amazing? Wouldn't flying at least be a source of temporary enjoyment, a way to defy physical limits?
It might be enjoyable, yes, but that's precisely the trap, according to this view. What is the purpose of acquiring a CD?
Power. Freedom. Enjoyment.
Enjoyment, exactly. They argue it only allows one to indulge in more enjoyment, more bog. And that enjoyment is, by definition, temporary. A few hours, maybe a few days at best.
And therefore fundamentally meaningless if the core problem of old age suffering remains unsolved.
Right. It's just a higher level distraction,
Yeah.
more sophisticated form of temporary pleasure seeking.
So the analysis is, again, kind of cruel but logical. If you use your hard-won cities just to accumulate more pleasurable experiences, you're simply increasing the gap, the contrast between your past power and your future, inevitable helplessness. You're actually multiplying the potential for future psychological agony.
That's precisely the argument. When that continuous suffering of old age eventually hits, the memory of having wielded those grand, powerful cities, it only serves to multiply the current pain.
Because those powers are now useless against the biological reality.
Exactly. The inability of the cities to stop the fundamental temporal decline, the relentless loss of strength, the constant pain, it renders them dreamlike, swapnified.
Like waking up from a magnificent dream of flying.
Only to find the nightmare of Vriddhavasta is crushingly real, and you can't even get out of bed. The solution has to be internal, permanent, unshakable by biology, not external, flashy, and temporary.
Okay, so this mandates a path of, well, rigorous self-reliance, doesn't it? Critical inquiry.
Absolutely. If the gurus out there are chasing cities or if they're teaching rituals that clearly don't address this core problem, then the seeker must use their own intellect, their buddhi.
And their own reason, their tark.
Yes, use reason to figure out what actually works, what path logically leads towards the eradication of this specific suffering. The core message is almost, don't outsource your fundamental existential logic.
Don't just blindly follow.
Definitely don't wait for others, gurus, teachers, anyone to just hand you the answer. You have to analyze the goal, liberation from old age suffering, and then rigorously assess whether any proposed method genuinely aligns with achieving that outcome.
If a spiritual path doesn't even claim to solve Riddhavasta, then from this perspective,
It's, by definition, a waste of your precious, limited time you need to find the real solution before the crisis hits.
but what about the role of a good teacher, a genuine guru? Do the sources dismiss that entirely?
No, not entirely. They do acknowledge the benefit,
Yeah.
but it comes with a massive caveat.
Okay.
They absolutely recognize that the right guides, genuine gurus, and teachers can significantly accelerate the process. They can help a seeker gain understanding in maybe months, understanding that might otherwise take a whole lifetime of stumbling around through personal effort alone.
So mentorship is valuable.
It's a huge potential advantage. However, and this is a crucial caveat, if the guru's knowledge, their system, ultimately fails to provide a practical, demonstrable solution to old age and death,
Uh-huh.
if the guru themselves is still caught in this trap, this chakra view of suffering,
Hmm.
then the seeker who follows them is just as stuck, equally trapped.
So the success of the guru is measured only by their ability to provide the specific outcome, not by their charisma or their following.
Exactly. Their ability to solve the problem of Riddhavasta is the only valid credential, according to this philosophy.
Which leads then to this really powerful call to action for humanity that's embedded in the text. It's not just an individual quest.
No, it's broader. The speaker encourages all of humanity, implies we should collectively apply our intelligence, our best minds, our science, our philosophy to this singular problem.
The problem of protracted suffering in old age.
Yes. They argue that if people would just stop blindly following one prescribed path, whether it's an old religious tradition or even just modern material science focused only on longevity,
Uh-huh.
and instead apply our greatest collective intellect to the resolution of this suffering, then many viable paths, many different solutions, yuktas, would likely emerge.
It should be humanity's primary R&D project, almost.
That's the implication. It shouldn't be some niche, dusty religious discussion. It should be the central focus of human ingenuity.
It really reframes what civilizational success looks like, doesn't it? If all our incredible efforts, science, art, politics, everything, still culminate for most people in, say, a 6-year period of helpless, continuous suffering.
Then perhaps, from this perspective, humanity hasn't truly succeeded at anything essential yet.
We've just been distracted by the temporary comfort of nidra, by sleep.
Exactly. But Vriddhavasta is the ultimate, unavoidable failing grade for any system that doesn't address it.
And this philosophical necessity, this failing grade, is what defines the next step, what actual resolution looks like.
Okay, so let's talk about what resolution actually means in this context. What does success look like?
Yeah, the end goal.
The ultimate state of success, they say, comes when the individual achieves the knowledge or finds the means, the yukti that's necessary to completely resolve the fear and the suffering associated with old age and death,
Breaking the cycle.
breaking the cycle.
Mm-hmm.
When this chakra view, as they call it, this maze or trap of suffering that seems to define existence when that is finally broken, cracked open,
Uh-huh.
then the entire psychology of life changes, instantly and fundamentally.
How so?
Well, think about it. If the fear of future suffering, that gnawing knowledge that all your present joy, your strength, your abilities will eventually turn to dust and pain if that fear is completely gone,
Okay.
then every single past enjoyment, every small pleasure you ever experienced immediately transforms. It becomes a source of complete, unadulterated happiness.
Prinsuk.
Because the negative consequence, the eventual suffering that negated it, has been removed. The threat is gone. Exactly. The negativity is neutralized. You can look back on your enjoyable moments, your successes, your pleasures, and say, that was wonderful, and crucially, it did not lead inevitably to a miserable, helpless end.
The memory is rehabilitated. It's no longer tainted by the future dread.
Precisely. And the source is quite emphatic about this.
Mm.
A life lived without the suffering of old age even if it's still followed by death, eventually is considered a completely happy life, a heavenly life, a Swargwala Jivan.
So the real hell isn't death itself, it's the years of suffering preceding death.
That's the core issue they identify, yes. The goal becomes either to live strong and die quickly, avoiding that period, or ideally to achieve a state of knowledge where you transcend the fear and suffering altogether, regardless of how death comes.
This is where they bring in that analogy, isn't it? The Kshatriya and the Brahmin. We need to be careful here to focus on the philosophical point, not a literal social category.
Absolutely crucial. It's purely an analogy to illustrate different degrees of success in confronting this Chakravya, this trap.
Okay, so the Kshatriya, the warrior figure.
The Kshatriya represents the first degree of liberation, perhaps. They live a life of strength, often purpose, maybe enjoyment, quag. But crucially, in this analogy, they often die relatively young and quickly, perhaps in battle. Maybe they only reach 40 or 60.
And by dying quickly, they bypass the whole process. They avoid the protracted, daily, helpless suffering of Vridhavastha.
Exactly. Their life was maybe a continuum of strength and activity, and their death, while perhaps painful, was sudden, a momentary distress, not a drawn-out 6-year affliction of dependency.
And the source views this as, well, a good death.
Relatively speaking, yes, leading to a state like heaven because their life wasn't ultimately ruined and overshadowed by those years of continuous pain and helplessness. They maintained their agency, their power, right up until the end.
So they achieved a kind of temporal, physical victory over the slow biological decay that brings the worst suffering.
You could put it that way,
Right.
yes, but that's still not the ultimate state, according to the source.
Right. The ultimate stage is represented by the Brahmin.
Yes, and again, Brahman here is defined purely by attainment, not by birth or ritual. It signifies a state of supreme being. The one who has, through knowledge, completely achieved the resolution, the nirakaram of both old age and death, or at least the suffering and fear associated with them.
So this person has transcended the entire cycle of fear and suffering. They've truly broken the trap from within.
That's the ideal, yes. Regardless of how long they live or how they die, they live without that existential dread.
So if I understand the analogy, the kshatriya uses action and maybe circumstance, like a quick death, to avoid the worst suffering, while the Brahmin uses knowledge and spiritual means to resolve the core problem itself.
That's a good way to summarize the philosophical distinction they're making. One is perhaps a tactical victory over decay. The other is a complete systemic victory over the fear of the future and the suffering it holds. Both achieve a measure of liberation from what they see as the deepest forms of human misery.
Okay, now we really have to tackle this radical redefinition of punya, merit, good deeds. Because this is probably the most challenging part for many listeners, myself included. It seems to overturn basic morality.
It is a radical revision, no doubt about it. It challenges deeply held beliefs about the value of altruism and good works. The traditional concept of punya is basically thrown out and replaced with a single, uncompromising criterion.
Which is?
Trapunya, the only punya that ultimately counts in this framework, is only that action, that achievement, that knowledge, which ensures the individual does not get trapped in that miserable, helpless state, the protracted suffering of old age.
Wow. So if your lifetime of good deeds, your charity, your service, if it doesn't protect you from ending up in that ultimate physical and psychological hell, then it wasn't ultimate punya.
Correct. From this perspective, those actions might have been socially beneficial, they might have generated good karma in some other sense, but they weren't punya in this ultimate existential meaning. They were good deeds with maybe temporal benefits, but they offered no final guarantee against the worst-case scenario.
And the source makes this point incredibly forcefully, using a very specific and potentially controversial example.
Yes, they use an example that resonates globally, referencing someone like Ratan Tata, known for immense philanthropy and service. They argue that even a life like that, filled with good deeds benefiting millions, cannot be considered ultimate punya under this specific definition if that individual were to later fall into a state of severe, protracted helplessness for years before their death.
That's quite a statement. We need to be really clear here. This isn't a judgment on the person's character, right, or the immense good their work did. What is the philosophy actually criticizing?
It's criticizing the disconnect between the temporal outcome, social good, personal satisfaction during life, and the existential outcome, avoiding protracted end-of-life suffering. The source's logic, however harsh it sounds, is brutally simple. If the entire life, no matter how outwardly exemplary or beneficial to others it was, ultimately ends in what they call a dreadful situation, a vikatstiti.
That state of helpless, continuous pain for years.
Yes. If it ends there, then from the perspective of the suffering individual, the value of all those past deeds is nullified in that moment. Because that past punya, those good deeds, failed to provide the one thing that truly matters in that state: protection, liberation from the continuous misery.
So the philosophical criterion for this ultimate punya is ultimate personal security against that final suffering, not just social goodness or conventional morality.
That clarifies it perfectly. The merit is judged solely based on whether it provides immunity against the only suffering that, in their view, truly matters, because it's inescapable and all-consuming otherwise. If it doesn't provide that immunity, it's incomplete punya.
Which leads to the final truth, the final takeaway the philosophy presents.
Yes. They state that when this reality becomes crystal clear to someone, when the full weight of Vriddhavasta, this potential for years of helpless suffering, is truly accepted and understood, the listener, the seeker, will logically, inevitably, drop all other work, all other pursuits, and focus entirely, single-mindedly on finding the solution, the yukti, to resolve aging and death, or at least the suffering tied to them.
Because they'll finally recognize that all other desires, all other goals, even if successfully fulfilled, are fundamentally incomplete. They're just fleeting distractions from the one task that is absolutely necessary.
Exactly. The human condition, defined by this shadow, this fear of the prolonged, helpless end, makes all other accomplishments ultimately secondary. Trivial almost.
The moment you truly grasp that fear, the spiritual pursuit isn't optional anymore. It's not about belief.
It becomes the only logical priority. It's framed as an issue of pure survival logic, really, not religious faith or dogma. Hashtag tag outro.
Well, this has certainly been a transformative deep dive. It really shifts the conversation about spirituality, doesn't it? It takes it out of the realm of, abstract beliefs or daily rituals and places it squarely into concrete preparation for a biological guarantee, a future crisis we all face.
Yeah, the core message seems incredibly clear. The spiritual life, this adhiyam, isn't primarily about finding daily comfort or peace, although that might be a side effect. It's fundamentally about finding a means, a yukti, to neutralize a specific unavoidable future state of suffering.
And that crisis, that state of Vriddhavasta, it provides the only reliable yardstick for measuring success.
It really does. The source implies quite strongly that if, say, 99% of people involved in what we call spirituality or religion don't even know what they should be seeking.
If they haven't clearly defined moksha or mukti in these practical existential terms.
Right. If they haven't defined the problem as the resolution of old age suffering and the fear that precedes it, then the learner's first duty, your first task, is simply to apply logic. Use your buddhi and tark to define the goal clearly. What problem are we actually trying to solve?
And the implication is, if that solution were found, if the suffering of old age could be reliably neutralized.
The source suggests life on Earth itself would instantly transform. All those sensory pleasures, all the joys of life, which were previously seen as dangerous because they set you up for that painful contrast.
They become safe.
They become sources of pure joy, Purnanska, because the fear, the negative consequence is gone. The Earth would cease to be what these sources might implicitly call a kind of hell, a narc defined by the underlying fear and eventual reality of continuous suffering, and it would instantly become a heaven, a swarg, a place of secure enjoyment.
Wow. Which leaves us and you, the listener, with this final, really provocative thought to chew on.
If the protracted suffering of Vriddhavasta is indeed the singular, non-negotiable core problem for all of humanity, then what specific method, what path, what yukti out of all the countless religious, scientific, philosophical systems known throughout history or practice today is dedicated solely and explicitly to solving this one problem?
Not just providing temporary relief, not just promising a nice afterlife, but actually resolving the suffering of the aging process itself, here and now, or providing immunity from its terror.
That perhaps is the ultimate test. The ultimate question to ask of any wisdom tradition, any scientific endeavor, any path you might choose to follow. Does it address this?